Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Welcome to the 2024 AoE2 Farming Report. Almanacs are very important in the farming world for predicting what kind of yields to expect, and of course, Age of Empires is no different. It's been 3 years since I did one of these, but in this video, we're going to go through the various farming bonuses in AoE2, including the newly introduced civilizations, and see how they all stack up through different stages of the game. The point being not just to take a little inventory of the farming bonuses and rankings, but also to make an up-to-date handy reference for myself and others. For all the numbers you'll see, I ran a 7-minute test with 20 farmers doubled up around a town center, with the idea being that farms aren't always going to be perfectly placed beside a drop-off point. Bonuses like carry capacity boosts really don't mean a lot with ideal farms, but can start to add up once you throw in even a little extra walking distance. I've also done a bit of math behind the scenes to account for the periodic 15 seconds of reseeding, which we don't have to get into with too much detail, but just know that even if the test is 7 minutes long, that reseeding time is accounted for in these values I show. With that out of the way, to start with our baseline farming rate given current pathing and everything else, just running some generic unupgraded farmers, I found they gather around 18 food per minute, though it's closer to 20 if we just look at the inner circle of farmers, so that's a number that comes up now and then as a rule of thumb. Adding in wheelbarrow and horse collar then boosts that by nearly 15%, helping the second layer of farmers in particular. It's hard to overstate how good wheelbarrow is for farming through both the carry capacity and faster movement contributions. Handcart and heavy plow then add proportionally a bit less, since of course the inner farms run into the maximum farming rate of 24 food per minute. And even the second layer of farms can start to brush up against that, making handcart still helpful, but not as impressive as we might expect. With the baseline established, now let's look at how various civilizations improve upon those in the early, mid, and late game. We'll start with the Aztecs, who have a bonus for +3 carry capacity. As we've seen with wheelbarrow, carry capacity is very important for farming. You're giving about a 10% improvement to those earliest farms, nearly acting like early access to wheelbarrow. Of course, as you start to add in more techs with wheelbarrow, heavy plow, and finally handcart, the Aztecs +3 loses a lot of its impact, ending up only barely helping just the most distant farmers in the late game. Those techs are of course giving you some benefit, but just be aware that while Aztecs are good farmers overall, their advantage is very front-loaded. Moving on next to the Mayans, interestingly, they're notable in the other direction. They have a bonus for longer-lasting resources, letting their farms carry on 15% longer, which on its own you'd think would boost their farming rate by reseeding less often. But to counteract that bonus, they have a hard-coded penalty behind the scenes. I've consistently found this makes them a little worse than generic farmers, particularly when everyone has wheelbarrow. They still have a great economy overall, and to be clear, are still getting a bump from wheelbarrow, but it's just not as large as usual. Luckily, they don't really focus on food-heavy units in the mid-game anyway, and this has just become a weird trivia quirk rather than a hindrance to the civ. Next up, we come to the Slavs. They were just recently returned to 15% faster farmers, which is technically implemented by giving them 15% faster food generated on farms and 23% faster farmers in those moments they're standing still and working. The net effect I found is something a little over +10% early on that grows to 15% in the late game, at which point the speed the farms produce the food becomes the bottleneck. That means while Slavs don't start as the best farmers, performing actually quite similar to Aztecs, in the late game they're by far the best. Moving on, let's check out one of the newer civs, the Romans. They advertise 5% faster construction and productivity with their villagers, and I found the results are pretty true to that in my testing. Notably, the farm production cap is also raised by 5%, so they even get that bump in the late game. Technically, this was implemented by making their farmers work in fact 9% faster when standing still, and in my testing seemed to nail the sweet spot once walking is factored in, resulting in the intended +5% net result. Credit where it's due, this is something the current developers have actually become quite good at getting right for the most part, and I imagine they're doing tests behind the scenes similar to mine here in order to get those values right. Moving on now to the Georgians, their one farm bonus is simply that a fortified church nearby increases the work rate of villagers. Just keep in mind, fortified churches aren't unlocked until Castle Age, but we can see regardless of upgrades, you're getting about 10% more than you otherwise would be without that building. Next up is the Khmer, who have the distinction of not needing to drop off food at a mill or town center, and instead just teleport food into your stockpile as it's generated. Besides the obvious advantage of having immediate access to the food that's being collected instead of having to wait for it, this is a massive boost to their early farming, worth about plus 15% compared to at least double-layered farms. What's funny is on paper, they're programmed to actually be 5% slower while working than usual, showing you how significant that saved walking time is to not just offset that, but thrive despite it. They are still helped quite a bit by wheelbarrow, so it's not a tech to ignore, but notice as we introduce more and more upgrades, the Khmer's bonus starts to disappear, similar to what we saw with Aztecs. Still, they're clearly set up for a great early to mid-game economy from this bonus alone. Next though, let's take a look at the Poles with their unique Folwark building. This isn't a totally fair comparison with a town center, since Folwarks only work on adjacent farms. So instead of a town center, we'll make this a comparison to mills, as both accommodate a group of 8 farms pretty naturally. Here though, notice Poles have 2 different advantages. The first is you can get 8 farms closer to the drop-off point than 8 farms around a mill, since the Folwark is slightly larger. The other more significant advantage is they drop off 8% of the food from their farm instantly when it's built. Those advantages together mean instead of plus 8%, they start out, I found, with a roughly 12 or 13% boost, though that decreases a bit as time goes on and the lower efficiency of other mills is negated with wheelbarrow and handcart. I should note the instant 8% dropped off actually leads to more than an 8% higher gather rate all on its own, which I hadn't realized until thinking about it more during this video. The easiest way to visualize why is to imagine farms dropped off half their food when a new farm was built, and in that case, it would increase the farming rate by not 50%, but 100, or double. So it's not a totally linear relationship of 8% food dropped off equaling 8% more food in total, but it's reasonably close. The caveat here is they have to be built beside a Folwark, so you don't get the protection of a town center and can't double up farms while getting your full bonus. But Poles using Folwarks clearly have a very solid farming economy either way. Moving on, we'll end with a few indirect farming bonuses I think are still worth touching on. We'll start with the Berbers, who after Dark Age walk 10% faster. We've seen walking speed be a pretty important component of wheelbarrow, and it's fair to expect something substantial here, but on its own, it's pretty underwhelming, even with all those double-layered farms, worth about a 3% collection rate boost for farmers, eventually dropping off to about a 1% boost, again running into the farming speed limit. Another interesting case is the Chinese, who have 10% more food on their farms, meaning they reseed less often, and therefore implying they should spend more time working. It turns out that effect, as I found before, is basically nothing in terms of food gather rate, so it's pretty much strictly a wood bonus and not a direct food bonus per se. Similar to that is the Sicilians, who of course get double the effect from mill upgrades like horse collar. Again, it's not to devalue that as a wood bonus, but functionally is worth about a 1% boost to farming rates specifically, unless you're turning those wood savings into more farmers. So to summarize and put it all together, looking just at Dark Age and early feudal farming before wheelbarrow, the big standout is the Khmer at plus 15%, followed by Poles around a Folwark, and then Slavs and Aztecs around 10 or 11%. Technically, Vikings should be sharing this top spot on the list, as they get wheelbarrow instantly. In fact, we should probably put them in instead of Georgians, given Georgians will probably have wheelbarrow by the time they make fortified churches, and it feels weird to imply Georgians have good farming in feudal age. Once everyone picks up wheelbarrow, at that point Slavs claim the top spot, with Georgians and Khmer as the next tier down, and Poles nearly keeping pace as well, with Aztecs at that point dropping off pretty hard. And finally, with all Castle Age upgrades coming in, Slavs continue to hold the top spot, followed by Georgians and then Poles, with no other real contenders here after Romans at plus 5%. I actually find it a little surprising how many of the good farming civs really drop off in the late game, with Aztecs and Khmer being the most dramatic. So that's a look at the state of AoE2 farming as of 2024. Big thanks to GS Jasper, James, Jared2142, Jockster, Justin, Samantha, Steven, Woodruff, and the first corporate Patreon sponsor, Mayan, as well as everyone else on Patreon for their continued support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.